1, 2, testing.
Yep. Okay, that's better. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I just have like a couple minutes. I wanted to make a little bit of an introduction, talking a little bit about how Unity can actually help with some of those challenges, but also why we've been here trying to discuss some of those things. So I'm Laurent Gibert. I'm part of the product strategy team at Unity and co-leading the Montreal office with Christine Rival. And yeah, we wanted to, it's a journey, a personal journey and collective journey into trying to have positive impact. And to me, when I try to reflect on my personal journey here, it's kind of a journey of awareness. Like it took me probably years since my wife at home been like pushing very hard for us to have an household that is, trying to make like effort in reducing waste or reducing energy consumption or water waste, that kind of things. And for years, it's always been like, oh, how do we reduce negative impact to the environment, to the world? And along that journey, trying to learn more about it, listening to podcasts and trying to get informed, realize that, well, reducing negative impact is one aspect, but trying to generate and lead positive change is like the game at the next level that maybe we can try to get into. And it took me a long time to understand, the different dynamics at play and the different like work environment that I'm part of to try to understand some of those levels to, how can you try to lead positive change? And it actually took like a random meeting that never was meant to happen at some video game convention a few years back when I met a small company that was kind of misleading. The name of the company was like a project I was working on, and I was very confused about that whole meeting. But then we had a chat, and they were doing this fantastic, interesting way to introduce positive impact into gameplay for game developers, like saving a turtle, planting a tree, that kind of like positive reward that you can give a player as part of your game. And I found that very interesting because I just realized at that moment that it is not just one way to have a positive impact, there's just a million different avenues. And it's all about connecting them together that can actually have a meaningful impact. And I think Unity in particular has a key role to play in connecting everybody together because Unity is a widely used game engine and there is a lot of applications that are being made in Unity. And so we can probably drive a lot of people at the table for that conversation. Just a few numbers, Unity is like running about 70% of the top grossing games on the mobile market. If you're thinking about like portable consoles and devices, it's usually between 50 to 60% of the games that are running on those devices that are being made with Unity, which leads to about 3.6 billion downloads of software that are running on Unity every single month. So it's a massive amount of people that are actually running on the Unity platform. And it feels like if Unity can make some amount of impact there, then we can drive some meaningful positive change in terms of environmental impact. That comes to, in particular, like energy consumption, which is something that software and hardware are very much involved into. And so that's kind of like what my personal journey has been about, like trying to find my way through some of those initiatives. And that's why we're doing this event today. In part in Montreal, we were expecting a little more people, and unfortunately, public transportation disruption kind of reduced a little bit the audience. But overall, what we're trying to do is to spread the knowledge about those challenges, how the things we're doing impact, positive or negative impact, and then creating awareness, had been happening to me, people making me aware of some of the things that I'm participating into and how that impacts the world. And so creating awareness is in turn potentially for you all, a way to turn you into leader of change. So thank you, Ben and SGA for organizing the content today and leaving it for you to go on. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Laurent. Yeah, fantastic to be here and speaking to you from all the way on the other side of the planet. We're here to talk about how we reduce the climate impact of the games industry, something that I really care about. And I think that, yeah, we've got a lot of room and scope for action in. I'll just jump right in. Here is what I want to talk to us about today, and I want to make it a bit of an interactive workshop. There's just unavoidably, there's a lot of kind of information that I kind of want to share with you to begin with, and then we'll have time for a bit of questions towards the end. And then after that, what I want to do is show you one of our tools that we produced as part of the SGA standard to help you to estimate the emissions of downloads from Steam. So I don't know, maybe if you have a Steam game, if you have already published a game on Steam, if you've got actual access to the Steam backend, we'll use the data you can pull straight off of Steam, put it in a spreadsheet, and give you some kind of estimates about, you know, what the impact looks like. But before we get there, we'll talk about, okay, how we measure climate impact, what we know about the game industry's impact, where they are, and then a bunch of really, really incredible examples of games that are already taking small, really, you know, just like minor tweaks to the experience to, reduce the sort of impact that they're having, and actually in the process make it a better game. So if this is the first time that you are joining us, and welcome to all of our online viewers as well. The Sustainable Games Alliance exists to help the sustainable transition in the games industry. We're not for profit. We're owned by the games industry. Our members decide how we operate and make decisions. And our mission is to make games the most sustainable they can be, maybe even the most sustainable form of entertainment on the planet. And the focus there is on decarbonizing the games industry. And we're doing that. Our theory of how the best way to approach that is by having a framework that we can share with the whole industry to regulate ourselves, right? To take the same approaches to how we measure emissions, measure climate impact, and start to, reduce it. So here's the core team: myself, Maria Wagner, online, who you might have seen pop up earlier, and Yuri Kupainen. And we are backed as well by some, really heavy hitters in the games industry, some names you might have seen, including David Helgeson, Unity's founder. And we also have an advisory board that provides sort of scientific and civil society perspective on the work that we're doing to make sure that, we're not facilitating greenwashing. That's not what we're about either. So how do we do that? How do we do something about it? Well, to begin, I want to get back to the real basics of how we impact the planet and how we harm, planet Earth that we live on. And the basic way that we do it is by emitting greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases trap the energy that comes from the sun. It comes at pretty much a constant rate and avoids them being re-radiated out into space, right? Like every time we add a kilogram of CO2 or a ton of CO2 to the atmosphere, we're increasing that amount of energy from the sun that we're keeping with us. Instead of allowing it to bounce back into space. So we measure the greenhouse gas emissions and the impact of the things that we do because we can't really manage anything that we're not measuring. It's just a fact, like if you don't know how bad the problem is, you don't know how to treat it. So all of these climate agreements and approaches that you might have heard of, from the Kyoto Protocol back in the 90s to the Paris Agreement, even the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is a kind of corporation-based target setting initiative, they all involve measuring and reducing greenhouse gas emissions over time. There's no other game in town. And that's because of this type of a graph, right? This is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. At present, we are there at the far end of the dot, the far end of the chart. All of human history everyone that's ever lived, that's been a human being basically, has existed within this chart. And if you were born after the 1970s, you have never experienced the kind of climate that most of humanity evolved in fundamentally. And so we're experimenting with the atmosphere. It's a radical shift. And it's having an effect, right? It's causing the planet to look like this, to create bigger and badder typhoons. This is just last week, typhoon, I think it was Regasa, smashed the Philippines. flooded Taiwan. There was incredible footage from Hong Kong of like waves crashing into hotel lobbies. And it's not just water, it also has the opposite effect. In other parts of the planet, they dry out. And so we have worse and worse fires in Spain and Portugal just this year, at the worst on record. In your location in Canada, you might remember 2 years ago in 2023, record-breaking fire season, right? More area of Canadian forest was burned than ever before. So these risks don't just exist out there in the world, they exist in the space that we make games, right? Like we make games in the world as well. And so these physical impacts are coming for the games industry. Impacts like extreme heat, intensification of cyclones, greater frequency of flooding. Ubisoft, in their most recent annual report, did a really detailed, really thorough risk analysis of their climate exposure. And they came up with this conclusion. By 2030, over 60% of assets will be classified as high or very high risk, requiring enhanced adaptation strategies. So by 2050, this exposure is expected to intensify, with more than 70% of assets facing critical risk levels, posing significant challenges to business continuity. That's just a corporate speak of way of saying we're going to have trouble doing what we're doing. We're going to have trouble making games in the same way as soon as 2030, 2050, if these impacts keep happening. And similarly, it's not just Ubisoft, it's all across the industry. All of the leaders are, making analyses of the kind of exposure that they might have to climate risks. So CD Projekt Red identified extreme heat as a high physical risk for them in their particular location. Prolonged heat waves or other severe weather phenomenon may cause power outages, and they regard the likelihood of that happening as being quite high, due to the nature of the Polish power grid and where they're located and things like that. So yeah, shout out to I think I saw one of the CD Projekt Red member teams join the call. So yeah, love their work. So yeah, here's a chart of that was just one of them. There's a whole host of particular vectors that the planet can start to get really angry and mad at, and make it really hard for us to keep making games. And some of these challenges come with the political shift as we start to take climate more seriously. Reputational risks, inadequate ambition might be perceived as greenwashing, stuff like that. So yeah, climate is real for the games industry, and if it's not here right now, it's here tomorrow. It's it's knocking on our door. So yeah, just some broad categories of ways that climate can impact games: reduce productivity. Staff when it's hot don't want to work. I certainly don't. It costs more to run air conditioners and blast the AC, things like that. Higher costs due to damaging infrastructure, all that sort of stuff. And yeah, just some general research on the broader economic impacts. The International Labour Organization predicts about a 2% reduction in working hours from heat stress by 2030. That's 5 years away, less than 5 years away. That might not sound like a lot, but aggregate that across the entire economy, and that has really big effects that flow on down to ordinary people. Yeah, you can see the rest of the details there. So how do we actually measure our impacts so we can start to do something about it? Well, the main approach that we take is for companies. That's games companies, concrete companies, chemicals companies, IT companies, everything. All bucket their emissions into one of 3 categories or scopes. Scope 1 emissions are the direct combustion of fossil fuels or the release of refrigerants. So usually that's running a gas boiler or heating your offices with natural gas. Scope 2 emissions come from the electricity that you purchase to run your lights, to run your servers, to power your computers, as well as a bit of heat and steam if you have those in your area. So that's emissions that happen somewhere else by a power company, but they're sort of your responsibility because you're using that power. And then scope 3 has a huge variety of all sorts of other activities across the value chain. It's 15 different categories. And these are considered shared responsibility, right? So it's not any one particular company that just owns those emissions. It's like, you know, I'll give you the example of like playing on Xbox, right? You may make the game, but Microsoft makes the hardware. So there's already like two players involved there. And then there's also the person, and the person who is playing the game, you know, has a responsibility maybe for their power, or, you know, all that sort of stuff. So it's a shared, yeah, responsibility. It gets very complicated, which is the thing that we want to address. We want to kind of sort that out a bit. So based on research from other industries, so this is a report from the Science Based Targets Initiative looking at what they expect, the general, you know, percentages or proportions of emissions within Scope 3. Scope 3 is the biggest category by far. It's where we can have the biggest impact. The biggest one they expect is Scope 3 category 11, or the use of your sold products, which kind of makes sense. And for us in the games industry, that means games on mobile, on console, on PC. The next biggest is usually purchased goods and services. That can be data centers, that can be software that you use, it can be computers, the IT equipment, dev kits, it can be just the food, the desks that people use. You know, each of those things has got to be made. It's got to be shipped from somewhere in the world to get to your office or your home. And an often overlooked one, because it doesn't show up as a major component in like a lot of the research, but I think for the games industry, we tend to overlook the impact of downloads and, you know, installing games. Downloads happen across the internet, and yes, they're much less impactful than, say, shipping plastic discs around the world, but that doesn't mean they have zero impact. They have some impact. It's small, but there are 1 billion gamers around the world. And so, yeah, the data center and the data usage adds up. For small teams and indies, a really relevant category is business travel. This can often be the single biggest component of, you know, a project. And I'll give you an example of that. So this comes from a report that I did for a studio called Die Fabrik back in 2023. So when they finished their game called Saltsea Chronicles, which is a kind of nice indie story game, they asked me to try and put a figure on, you know, the cost of the production of that game. It took 3.5 years. It's about 30 people on the team, and they worked fully remote across mainly Denmark and the UK, but there were, you know, a bunch of other countries as well. The single biggest category was that purchased goods and services. And the next biggest one was business travel. And for them, that was 2 international trips, just 2. That was more than all of the other categories or all the other impact, aside from, you know, all of the purchases in their footprint. And because it was an unreleased game, you know, we couldn't estimate the impact of players. They just didn't have any yet. So yeah, their total added up to about 5 to 10 tons a year over that 3.5 years, which might not sound like a lot, but I guess it kind of all adds up. Next, jumping up to a bit bigger scale, you know, the other end of the games industry, we have a company like Ubisoft, 20,000 people, 2 billion euros in revenue, and their biggest category is purchased goods and services. That was like 60% of their footprint. This is the most recent year they've got a chart for. In that, digital marketing was a really big part of it, you know, just putting ads on Instagram and YouTube and other platforms to reach players was, you know, has a measurable impact on their corporate footprint. Data centers were a big one, buildings, business travel proportionally was really small, but still, like, you know, for a company of 20,000 people, I think it's like probably a big number. And then they weren't able to fully measure their end users because they don't quite have the data for it all and still working on a process. But when they did, when Microsoft basically started to do it for them on their Xbox, it doubled their entire Scope 3 footprint. So yeah, like that backs up the kind of research from elsewhere that we've seen. We expect gamers to be the kind of biggest part of our impact. And so the annual footprint of Ubisoft, 145,000 tons. So we've jumped up quite a bit. And then the last example, Sony. Sony is not just a games company, it's also a manufacturer of TVs and all sorts of other stuff. It makes movies, it's got music. 100,000 people, $80,000 billion. The games component with the PlayStation segment of it was about $30 billion. And they did report on what they thought the end users on the PlayStation Network were in 2024, about 6 million tons. And that's actually lower than the year previous. It's come down a bit. So yeah, that's like, yeah, pretty big. I should have put in a comparison to say like how many cars that is on the road or something. But anyway, it's a lot. Yeah, very different type of company, but yeah, the games part is yeah, still pretty hefty. So what is the total footprint of the games industry? Right, we still don't actually know. When you add up all of the companies that are disclosing their corporate footprints, the most recent numbers I have are that it was about 8.4 million tons. Lots of that doesn't include end users, doesn't include gameplay. It also excludes all of Sony, Microsoft, Google, Apple, and Tencent. Each of those adds, millions of tons. Excludes digital distribution networks like Steam and the Epic Games Store. GOG.com is in there because CD Projekt Red calculates that. Good on them. And it also excludes most of PC gaming, which is probably tens of millions of tons. We know PC hardware is some of the most energy intense ways we can game. Also excludes disc distribution. There are still discs and cartridges being sent around the world. And it excludes the manufacturing of consoles, mobiles, and PCs. So there's a lot. There's a lot that we still don't have a clear picture of, and that, yeah, we kind of really need to. So my best guess, and it really is just a guess, is that the figure is probably somewhere around about 50 million tons, just based on some, back of the envelope numbers. And if you want to compare that, it's comparable to Sweden or Norway annually. So gaming is probably a small country in terms of its emissions impact. And the equivalent cars on the road, 11.5 million driven for 1 year. So that's, yeah, quite an impact. Or you can think of it as 10.5 million US households and their electricity use. It uses the same amount of, or would output about the same amount of emissions over the same year. And if you're ever looking for ways to kind of make greenhouse gas emissions numbers relevant, you can use the EPA's greenhouse gas equivalencies calculator, which is, yeah, it just gives you those numbers. So what do we do about it? This is the really, really fun bit, right? This is where we actually start to turn from going, oh God, this is the bad stuff, to what can we actually do about it? And we've got a few. We've got a few things to kind of talk through in detail. So the first one we'll start with is eco modes, this idea of eco modes that really it was Microsoft's Xbox sustainability team bringing together a bunch of new measuring abilities and a bunch of different game studios and saying, all right, what can we do with this? Epic and Fortnite saved a wind farm's worth of power by using eco modes. And then Ubisoft did it, Call of Duty did it, a whole bunch of other games are kind of doing it. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what it means to do an eco mode, how you do it. Then we'll talk about pause rendering and the effect of changing your menus from being like fully 3D into 2.5D, so you kind of fake it, and the actual power efficiencies that we can save by making some of those changes. Screen dimming as well. That's another way that the Elder Scrolls Online has managed to save a bit of power amount we can't quite measure, but we know is real and is a real saving. And Minecraft has also done work to basically they start the eco mode and ramp down the power use when the controller is disconnected. Yeah. So a lot of this stuff is around finding times and places where doesn't impact the player, right? This is basically energy that we're spending that we don't need to. But that's not the only way that we can improve the efficiency of our games and have positive impacts. So we'll also talk about the hardware limitations that Battlefield 6 encountered and recently talked about how it actually helped their game. And I'll talk about some of the limitations to the sort of things we can do with that. And then a really cool example, and I think I saw him join here, was Torbjorn Soderman and the Goals game, which is optimized for like a really good user experience, low fan noise and heat. So coming at the energy question from like, yeah, just a very different angle, but really, really productively. And then lastly, the PlayStation 5 has a new power saver mode, which will, yeah, kind of mention that. So all of these examples we're going to get into save power without taking a single thing away from the player experience. And often actually it improves it. Yeah, which I think is really exciting. So let's talk about eco modes and how Fortnite managed to save a bunch of power. So what they did is Microsoft built in new telemetry capability in its Xbox dev kits and its a certain number of Xbox consoles, and produced a tool to profile the power consumption of a game. And they call it PIX, or the power, maybe it's performance identification tool or something. And so they just play the game and you measure it and you see, okay, it's running in a particular configuration. Maybe the screen resolution starts at 100% and it uses the full capacity of the console. All right, what if we reduce it to 75%? And then to 50%, and then lowering the frame rate and resolution. So they basically just played around with it a bit, experimented, and noticed that the things that had the biggest impact on power were resolution and frame rate. And this is kind of the two key elements that tend to be major controls of the kind of energy consumption. So once they realized that out, they needed to figure out how to implement it. And so they started with a very small little test. They put a 1-minute timer on the game. So basically when you're sitting on a menu screen, and you're doing nothing, they reckoned, okay, you're probably AFK, you probably aren't looking at the screen, you probably don't care about how the image looks, but we don't want to completely turn the screen off because then you might be distracted, be like, oh, what's going on? Has our computer crashed or something? Yeah. So all they do is they dip the resolution and the frame rate. And so you can see here on this chart, this is like days in February. I think this was either 2022 or 2023. And yeah, so they implemented this drop, set the maximum resolution down to 60 after 1 minute. And then after 2 minutes, dropped it to 50% and lowered the frames per second as well. So put a cap on the number of frames the game is generating. And this is just sitting in a menu screen on Fortnite. And so this is like the average, average power consumption on an Xbox X, Series X, once this is implemented, and it like dropped by a significant amount. I guess people spend a lot of time on the menu screens and a lot of time doing nothing. And they went, okay, this is great. We can take it further. We analyzed player sentiment. No one has even really noticed. No one's mad about it. And all right, we'll just do it. We'll crank that dial right up. And they made it drop in up to 30 seconds, dropped the frame rate to 30 FPS, and halved the resolution. And yeah, no one really noticed. No one really minded. It just kind of worked. And because they have the ability to measure all of the energy that's being used, or like kind of model the energy that's being used across the Xbox Series X or the Xbox consoles, they were actually able to measure a before and after difference in the amount of power that was used across the entire Fortnite player base on the console. And they also implemented it on PC as well. But yeah, so as a result of the changes, they estimated 200 megawatt hours a day of electricity was saved across the Fortnite player base, or 73 gigawatt hours a year. And that's like 14 little wind turbines for a year. That's like a small wind farm. these days, which I think is incredible. If you think about that, it's like building something that might take years in minutes. Like literally this whole process, I think from beginning to end was like a couple of weeks of work. You can read it in their white paper. And it's just from changing the behavior of the game at a point of the game where no one's even really doing anything. They're not even playing it. So yeah, how much more can we like squeeze out of games? Yeah, I think there's a lot. So Microsoft had that really fancy tool to do it. They have, built-in numbers and stuff, but you can also validate your own power measurements with just like a wall plug power meter. They're kind of good enough. This is me doing it with my PC and, looking at changes and basically any meaningful intervention in most use cases that shift power consumption will be visible on a $20 wall plug power meter. It's when you get into trying to optimize for even more efficient devices, we might need more accurate tools. So mobile and switch, which already use tiny amounts of power, but because there's so many of them, I think there's huge potential to optimize them. Then we might need something that actually is a bit more, has a bit more accuracy to it. So Fortnite, I think, pioneered it, and lots of other studios across the industry went and ran with it. So eco modes were used in For Honor, an Ubisoft game. They started already with 2 graphics modes in the game settings. They had a performance mode for like high frame rates and low resolution, and a quality mode, which is all the bells and whistles, 60 frames per second, 4K resolution. Started again with just like testing with power meters and expanded to add the same sort of eco mode settings, idle states, drop the frame rate, drop the resolution. And one of the key insights that they had was that when you put it to be the default, when you default the setting on, most people actually keep it. And so they ended up, I think, with 4 modes: an off mode, a minimal mode where it only affects the UI, a smart where actually anytime you're idle anywhere in the game for 2 minutes, it starts to drop this frame rate thing. And then, as soon as you come back, it goes back to normal. And then there's a full mode where, it will just apply the same settings everywhere. And again, they say it took 2 months of work to do this. This was like not a massive project. And so now we can kind of apply it to our games. And then Call of Duty as well did the same thing. You kind of might not expect Call of Duty to be the place to find like eco warriors, but there you go. It's in there, and by all accounts, it's has been remarkably successful. It's, again, if it's just in there by default, lots of people just leave it on because it's barely noticeable. So let's talk a little bit about what ways we can communicate to players what the benefits are to them as well, because I think that's kind of an important thing as well. So one of the ways we can say that is by talking about power prices, right? Electricity, I think, it just lives in the wall. Unless you're a climate and sustainability brained person like myself, probably you don't even think about it when you plug a appliance in or something. That's my particular curse to bear, that I've always like thinking about that. But for most people, it's just there. But we have to pay for all of the power that we use. And so, energy prices around the world are not always super cheap. The Canadian price average is about 19 cents per kilowatt hour. The Danish average is quite a bit higher, about 29 cents. In Australia, it's not great. It's 33 cents a kilowatt hour. And so, if we look at how much power different consoles use, we can start to talk about, okay, how much we've saved and what it might cost players in terms of money, to actually run them. So Nintendo Switch, 7 watts. It's nothing, or almost nothing. It's not really nothing, but it's close enough. It only really becomes an issue at like a really, really big audience. PlayStation 5, about 200 watts, give or take. A low-end PC, probably about 250, 260 watts. That's my best estimates based on the Steam Valve hardware survey data. And in a high-end PC, I think, yeah, like, it could be almost the sky's the limit, but I think the average high-end PC, again, based on the Steam user data, is about 565 watts, which is, yeah, that's a lot. So what does 100 hours of gaming on each of these platforms look like? Well, on Nintendo Switch, it's 13 cents, so that's pretty good. On PS5, it's about $3, $3.80. A low-end PC, it's about $5, and then a high-end PC, maybe it's $10. So yeah, let's think about individually. I think these kind of savings, when we're shaving off, a few watts here and there, they're not going to show up on a user's power bill in a hugely noticeable way, but in the aggregate, they really, really do start to matter. So 100,000 players on Switch playing for 100 hours. I think that's $13,000, unless I've stuffed my maths up. The PS5, $385,000, a low-end PC, $499, and a high-end PC, yeah, $1 million. So saving even 5% of the power that a game uses across 100,000 players in a game that they're going to play for 100 hours, like, yeah, you could be saving your players 50 grand in power. That's, yeah, across 100,000 players. I don't know, it's not that much, but it all kind of adds up over time. Yeah, so some big numbers. So beyond eco modes, what else can we do? We can change the way that the game operates when it's paused. So Halo Infinite, the team at 343 Industries looked at this and kind of investigated this one. The image here on the right shows campaign gameplay on the Series X at 4K at about 60 frames per second. And yeah, it's using about 64% of the capacity of the console, or 185 watts. When you pause the game initially, in the sort of earliest version of Halo Infinite, it still rendered in the background at 60 frames per second and in 4K, even though it's covered up with this blurred screen. So the console is doing all this extra work that no one benefits from. So it's just pure waste, really. So what they did is they went, all right, we can optimize that. We can improve the efficiency. So they paused the screen and lowered the, so when you pause, you now lower the screen resolution to 1080p. And yeah, it shifted power draw down to about 55%. So that's like 20 watts, I think they saved, just on pause menus. People spend a lot of time on pause menus. People like the way people play games is they often, you pick up and play, you put it down and forget about it until the console goes to sleep, or, you come back from something. So it's, yeah, it really kind of adds up. This is really 20 watts of power you're saving your user for free. I can't really think of a reason why we wouldn't do this, except that maybe it's hard to do, it's a challenge. But yeah, it seems not to be. So they say stopping the world render when it's paused, or replacing it maybe with like a static image, culling everything behind it. Lowering the frames per second and resolution, super easy. But we can also go further. We can optimize our menus. So when Halo Infinite originally shipped, it shipped with 3D menus, 60 frames per second, 4K image, and yeah, basically maxed out the GPU. I don't know if you played it. I played a little bit of it after it came out, just like multiplayer, and it was like, okay, this is, yeah, really taxing. And that means, yeah, energy, wasted kind of energy. It was using a lot of power. So they started by dropping the frames per second to 30, so that it wasn't, buttery smooth or whatever, but they're like, okay, we can go further. We can actually fake this effect. We don't actually need to render the whole scene in the background. This is a menu, for goodness sakes. People are selecting what lobby they're going into. They're not like, I don't know, drinking in the aesthetic and like poring over every detail. So what do they do instead is yeah, swap it out for like a fake 2D image. You can kind of render it out beforehand, and you just put a 3D model in front. If 3D model can, animate, it can kind of do things and stuff. And yeah, the player doesn't know any different. It looks exactly the same to them. This is like a classic game design trick. I think it's really clever and really smart. And yeah, it doesn't take a whole lot. It's really easy to implement or to upgrade, and you can kind of swap out the background image. You can create it in whatever format you want. It could just be like a JPEG. You can make it yourself, or you can get someone else to do it. And yeah, load times are quicker too. Yeah. And so yeah, they iterated on this and made it even cooler. So instead of it just being like just a matte background, they kind of baked in some depth of field effects, and they put some ground fog in between the the model and the backdrop, making it look like, quite elaborate. It does come with some constraints though as well. The 3D avatars have to kind of match the backdrop. You got to light them in the same way. And it doesn't really support motion. So the motion of the camera has to kind of be locked. You can't move in or zoom out or anything. Although maybe there are cool tricks you could do. I don't know. But yeah, generally, like, you're not going to be swinging the camera around and, change that sort of stuff. Yeah, and they also mentioned that you can't really support depth of fields on the 3D model, but you can, yeah, put the blur into the kind of background. Whoops. So here's a comparison side by side between two different seasons of that multiplayer menu screen. On the left, that's a fully 3D scene and using 64.8% of the power of the console. And on the right, it's the faked, I think it's a cool trick, 2.5D version image, which now uses 47.5%, so 30% saving of power. And yeah, once you add in it has a lower resolution, lower frame rate, sorry. Frame rate? Resolution, yeah. So yeah, all of this is about saving power. And yeah, I really like this idea that kind of got popular in a meme a couple of years ago, that lamps in video games use real electricity. Because they do. If you think about it, the screen that we play games on has to be powered by electrons. There is no games. There's no digital games without electricity. That's just a fundamental part of it. And until we decarbonize the world's entire electricity system, which is years and years away, that's like a urgent project. It's going to be on us to use it as efficiently as we possibly can. So another example from the Elder Scrolls Online, they just they went, okay, screens use power. OLED screens in particular. I don't know if you have an OLED screen, maybe you got an OLED switch, or I have an OLED TV. I love it. But it is kind of power hungry. It does use a lot of electricity because each pixel is like lit. It's its own little LED. It's not like one, big light bar behind it. So dimming the screen when it's inactive, when the player's away from their computer or away from wherever they are, kind of just makes sense. Consoles have that baked in. There's like default operating system level settings for that, but on PC, yeah, Windows doesn't really do that or have that, or it doesn't really make sense. Like, you wouldn't dim an application usually, yeah. So yeah, they just started to do it. They're like, all right, we'll dim the player's screen after 5 minutes, and we'll use less power that way. Because there's no monitoring built into like computer monitors or anything like that, we don't know how much it saves. It could be a tiny bit, or for an OLED screen, it could actually be fairly significant, but it saves power, and the savings are real. So I think that's worth considering as well. So yeah, the last one I want to come to, talking about like mobile devices, because really we've talked about console and PC gaming, but on mobile, I think energy efficiency makes a lot more sense. Even with the caveat that I opened with, that measuring improvements in efficiency is really hard, and we need quite sophisticated tools. But it has all these upsides, right? It reduces battery consumption. If you can make your mobile game run, I don't know, 20% more efficiently, that's 20% more time players could spend playing it without worrying about their battery going flat. It also, in a sort of roundabout way, reduces the number of charges that your players might end up using, which actually wears out the battery quicker. And batteries in phones, in Nintendo Switches, in any mobile device, they are consumables. They don't last forever. And more efficient games mean that more devices can run it as well. And so we've learned this lesson from huge smash hits like Roblox and Subway Surfers, that if you can make your game run on a potato, you can reach a humongous amount of players, right? Like you can play on just about everything. That doesn't mean that every game should have to be like that, but it does give us something to kind of focus on. And I think, given the economic situation in games at the moment, anything that can get us to new players is going to be a welcome one. So, yeah. And I think the last one of these is just from the examples that I wanted to kind of mention in particular was disconnected controllers in Minecraft. So basically they looked at the disconnected controller screen. When the players put down the controller, this is just another way to tell, is the player actually there? Do we really need to render everything on the screen? Or do we need to, do it in the highest capacity? Probably not. So control activity means they're AFK at the very minimum. They're, doing something else. So they lowered the frame rate when the controller was disconnected for longer than 60 seconds. And yeah, here you go. So on the left, you can see the energy use, the power use during active gameplay, and then the power use when, after that controller is disconnected, and then it kicks in and dips down the power usage. And so yeah, saves small, but quite substantial amounts of power that add up over millions and millions of players. So you can see in the chart here, on Xbox Series X, the average wattage during gameplay was 100 watts. And then during stage 1 of the disconnect, it was 89 watts. And then stage 2, it dropped down to 80. So like 20%, they saved 20% of the power just by implementing efficiency. So that's the kind of active eco mode stuff. That's a lot of finding ways to identify where we're doing things that we don't need to be doing in games, in terms of using energy. But there are other benefits to efficiency as well. So recently, I think this was, just last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, one of the Battlefield 6 tech leagues said that, optimizing for Series S made the game way more stable. They had to optimize for the memory usage and all sorts of other things that, just this a bit more entry-level device, this entry-level console, the Series S, meant that, okay, they had to get this stuff in order. They had to, make it run on that, which benefited every other hardware platform as well. Now, the effect on the power consumption from that is unknown, but if we haven't measured it before and after, we don't know this is a case study, but I would bet that if you measured before and after, it would probably save power, but it would only do that if CPU and GPU aren't already at 100%, right? Like if you improve the efficiency during development by 10%, and then your artist goes in and says, "Oh, okay, I can push 10% more pixels or polygons in a scene," then you're just back where you started. You might have made the game better, but it's not translating to an efficiency gain that also benefits the planet. So we need some kind of eco mode style intervention there as well. So there are places we can make efficiency improvements without it translating to energy saving. That's, I think, an important point to stress. But I think we have nowhere in no way exhausted the potential for other areas in games that we could optimize, finding optimize out waste. So really cool example here, and I hope he doesn't mind me speaking on his behalf, but yeah, we had a quick chat the other week and I was like totally blown away by what they're doing. So really cool example of what I'm talking about here in terms of, the limit of is the kind of the hardware, if we don't intervene in it, is the game goals, which is a super optimized game. It can easily run, hundreds and hundreds of frames per second on a high-end PC. There's really no practical use for that though. It just like makes your hardware really, you're pinging it like, yeah, it really goes hard on the machine, and it generates a bunch of heat, and then your fans spin up really, really fast too. So technical director Torbjorn Soderman wrote some code to monitor the heat and the load on player GPUs, and was like, all right, what if we just go to like half and still get really good performance? Do we really need to run our PC super hot? And yeah, and it's like it produces a better experience. No one needs 500 frames. Yeah, and this is saving power not in an idle state. I think that's kind of like a step above. That's like a brand new kind of thing, I think. So yeah, we're holding a meetup with Torbjorn to talk about his work and yeah, hopefully get more insight into how he's done it and start to kind of disseminate some of this knowledge across the industry in December. So there's a link to register for that here. And maybe let me see if I can put the link in the chat actually, just while we're here. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so really, really fantastic example. And then lastly, I wanted to mention, like, even the hardware side is thinking about efficiency too, and energy saving. So the PS5 just introduced in its most recent update a power saver mode. You just turn it on and it saves power. I don't know how. I don't know the exact details. Possibly it throttles some aspect of the hardware or disables something, because their only note there is basically the VR mode is unavailable. And VR takes a lot of processing grunt, so maybe they've switched off a core or something. I don't know. This is just total speculation from my part. Yeah, so it'll be really interesting to see how that goes, how that's accepted, and what the uptake is like by players. It's literally too early to know. It's been out for I think all of 2 weeks. So summing up this, sorry, it's been a very information dense part of it, but yeah, we'll have time for questions in just a second. The common element of all of this is measuring power. Measuring the actual power that we use on the devices enables us to manage that power. And managing power means we get to manage the emissions and the climate impact that we have. Control over power also gets us things like a better player experience. Quieter fan noise, less heat, longer battery life. It also gives us lower climate impacts, gives us access to new or lower spec platforms. Maybe you can port to Switch now. Yeah, and basically the thing I want to leave you with, the image is, wouldn't it be awesome if every game platform kind of did this for you automatically? And use the same approach to do it, use the same methodology, had a shared set of, approaches to how we would calculate that, the same methods. Imagine if your game engine measured it and collected that data for you and gave you some benchmarks, could tell you how you're performing versus, other games, told you what the climate impact of your game is with your audience, and gave you some guidance on, where you can intervene. Just an idea, maybe an idea that we might see sooner rather than later. Yeah. So I think that ends the sort of informational part, and yeah, more than happy to take any questions or even have like a discussion. Do you want to ask Torbjorn something about what he's done in goals? He's right here. We might as well.
I'm not sure if you want to take questions here in Montreal or online. We already have some questions here in Montreal. Should we start here?
Yeah, please.
So me, okay, I'm trying to struggle because I've got so many questions. Excellent presentation. I just wanted to sort of understand a little bit where the industry is going or where you see the industry going since you've studied kind of this material. For instance, when you look at, for instance, APUs or, you know, like integrated chips, right, with graphics, for instance, in a Rogue Ally, for instance, or a Steam Deck. To me, that seems like a nice path forward to sort of reduce the wattage intake in gaming. At the same time, you have NVIDIA and companies of that sort that is sort of pushing more watts per like graphic cards or, you know, all that. So there's like almost like two different like pushes, one that uses less electricity versus one that uses more. So I'm wondering like where you see the industry going, especially with AI and frame generation. How does that even impact wattage, the frame generation sort of technology, LSS, all that stuff. So big question, but I'm just wondering where you see the industry going. You know, are we going to go to more power consumption, more FPS, more, you know, visual beauty, or more, you know, less, more saving of power consumption, you know, through APUs?
Yeah. Gosh. Yeah, look, I don't have any. Yeah, like I definitely don't have a crystal ball on this. Like I don't think it's set in stone, and I think a lot of the decisions are being made, you know, as we speak, in terms of, you know, what the future direction is. And I guess maybe two things to kind of mention. So number one is that Sony have said basically they think that the efficiency gains from integrating, you know, on more and more chips onto the one die from the APU is basically reached its limit. They don't imagine seeing improvements in the next, you know, or at least within this generation. Probably, you know, in the future, the next one will be more efficient. But yeah, the idea that the next PlayStation would use, PS6 would use less power than the PS5. I don't know. You'd get, I think my idea would be, you know, kind of like putting a limit or a moratorium or something on graphical grunt. I think we've also kind of reached the end of the runway for you know, how much we can really squeeze out of like video graphics, you know. In terms of the DLSS stuff, I don't know what the impact of that is. I really quite like the upscaling and the frame gen stuff. I find it like I barely notice it. I notice a little bit. But I think, yeah, it seems like a real kind of no-brainer to save resolution. I think, yeah, I don't have any kind of hard figures offhand or strong evidence about it, but I suspect that it does save power comparatively. I think it's a kind of faster method of generating the equivalent number of pixels. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there because we could just go forever. Yeah.
You want to react? Yeah, I would do comment to this question. It's an excellent question because of the rise of the technology, and yeah, there is two ways of observing this. First part, I believe, like new technology is consuming less. New graphic card, they have less power consumption, and that's also important because there is a technique called upscaling. So they render the screen in a very small screen, and then they upscale it. So it will consume a lot less power, but also it will require less computation in the graphic card and also less computation in all of the other parts. And also the neural rendering, which is different than the traditional way of rendering things like vertices and the pipeline of rendering in the graphic card. It's a way, it consumes a lot of the energy, but neural rendering is like estimation of where it should be this or what will be the color of this. So I believe in the future we will have less consuming softwares because the graphic card is not doing none of the traditional computation. So I wear different hats. teach game programming using game engines, but that's something maybe in the future I want to see, because I wear also another hat, which is computer vision programmer. I'm a computer vision programmer, and I tried a lot of rendering techniques, and you can say the traditional rendering, one thing that can take several frames to be rendered, but one like more advanced scene using neural rendering, it will take a lot less time. So yeah,
Hmm.
this is in macro level, but yeah, different when we have a lot of, because the GPU that they are creating is not used only for game rendering, but also it's used for mining, for a lot of other things that consume a lot less, a lot more than gaming. So yeah.
Hmm.
If I can add also another perspective to the same question, I think what might drive up or down the overall consumption in gaming might also be driven by player behaviors. Something that we are expecting to see happening at some point in front of us is players be less attached to a specific device for playing and be more playing across devices. So I start basically my game session on my living room and then continuing on my mobile phone and maybe continuing on like a mobile device in another place. And so to the point that Ben was making a little bit earlier in the presentation around when you target the optimization of your game on low-end devices, that it gives you a range of throttle of power that you need to implement into your game to give the same gameplay experience, but also different variability in terms of like complexity being displayed depending on the device you play, that a lot more game studios will be conscious of trying to target lower-end devices so that they can actually ship cross-platform gameplay. And I think that's probably going to be one of the big driver of lowering energy consumption in gaming.
Great, good news.
Maybe we'll just kind of go to a couple of the questions from the chat. So I think Katie Blake asked whether the case studies are listed somewhere. So most of the early ones, the eco mode ones, are they like the case studies come from the Microsoft Xbox sustainability website. Like they have a documentation page where they've got excerpts of the testing they did, and I think some of them, maybe not those ones, but I know in the Epic white paper they have they actually have like code snippets that you can just like if you're in Unreal, you can just like literally copy and paste and say, all right, this idle timer, drop it into my game, implement the same kind of eco mode as the Fortnite one. But yeah, so the eco mode ones, a couple of the other ones like screen dimming and like the Halo Infinite Pause one, all on the Xbox sustainability website. They've done probably the most so far. The goals example, yeah, you have to come along to see Torbjorn talk about it in December. Another question was, are any of the approaches available as a Git repo? Not any of the ones that I think I mentioned. One that I did come across just today, and I think he's in the call, is by Julian. I'm sorry if I get your last name wrong. Julian Lukasiewicz, who I think is a PhD student working on kind of PC and video game energy monitoring, and his paper does link to a GitHub repo for their implementation of it. If you have a link to that, feel free to drop it in the chat, because yeah, I'm sure people would love to kind of look at it. I think that was all the other online questions we had. Shall we oh yeah, another question from the audience.
Yeah. Hi Ben, thanks for the speech. So last year we prototyped some code here during a hack week about being able to have power readings and bring that information to Unity users. And we did that on mobile, PC, and consoles. and found out a few things like that on mobile, we'd be able to derive that information from battery level. But that was still inexact. On desktop and laptops, it was super hard to get any information because of hardware reliability and security issues. And only on consoles we got interesting stuff. Like maybe on Nintendo Switch, we have everything we could dream of, like CPU, GPU, and RAM, power metrics, and Xbox is missing stuff there. But basically, it's just super difficult to have this kind of standard visibility on power consumption across different types of device. So I was just wondering if you were aware of any plans of turning toward like integrators and system makers to address this really on the hardware side rather than looking at the game dev side of things.
Torbjorn, you look like you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I guess I can talk a bit about that because that's sort of what I've been looking into. There's no real standardization here, but there are like the independent hardware vendors have done different APIs for it. So you have like on the NVIDIA side, you have something like NVML, where you actually can read the GPU power consumption and you can also read heat. Basically, that's what I did in my work. And you have a similar things for AMD, which is called ADLX. So it's also low level, sort of driver level API, but it's public, so you can just use it. And Intel have a similar one. And that means you're sort of covering like 89, 90%, like Qualcomm doesn't have anything. I asked them as well, but so you can get that and you can sort of write a wrapper around those things. So you can have like different backends based on what your sort of hardware level is. But that's the way, and it didn't take super long time for me to do this. I work with other things and I did this sort of on the spare time. So yeah, it is possible, but I agree it's hard to find information. I talked to Microsoft about this. Why wouldn't you sort of add something in the sort of DirectX standard to get this? Because that would be great. But they haven't sort of listened so far.
Yeah, so I think the standard question and like I think the benefits or the potential benefits of standardization in the games industry is like massive, absolutely massive. At the moment, with the Sustainable Games Alliance, we're mostly looking at software, but I could foresee like a potential future point where, I don't know, 5, 6, 10 years down the track, the software stuff has been solved and the hardware vendors are starting to, get questions about like, okay, how do we improve the standardization of sharing this information? And yeah, and then maybe we do end up with like a hardware standard for how to disclose, the power sensor readings from GPUs and South Bridge things, and I don't know, all sorts of different parts of gaming hardware. Because again, I think the challenge for PC is that there isn't a kind of single platform owner. Like on console, you have the owner of the console, like Nintendo or Microsoft or Sony, and they often will have a real interest in making that stuff available, particularly Microsoft. They've done heaps of tooling in that space. So, but PC doesn't have that. PC has like 500 different hardware makers and everyone's kind of doing their own thing because competition and all this stuff. There are all sorts of amazing positives to the PC ecosystem, but the downside is that there is very little kind of coordination. And I think one of the things that we want to do is provide some kind of a forum for the industry to engage in these conversations and have that kind of coordination. Yeah.
Maybe just, can I
Yep.
add a word from the Unity point of view? So even though like maybe we don't have like the hardware, kind of nice ways to like compare hardware to hardware. At the software level though, every time like the device runs on battery, it kind of makes the problem actually easier because we can measure battery consumption. And that's like where Unity lands in terms of core market. So that's some of the conversation we've been having with SGA is about, can we at least get on like untethered devices, some standard benchmarks, we try to build on so that we can inform game developers about how does the actual game perform compared to other products on the market. So that's something that we can try to get to. We've been like advancing in that direction and having a lot of conversation to try to drive some amount of standardization there. So we can, at least at the software level, across devices, on portable devices, have like similar benchmark energy consumption. But yeah, it does make it a little more complicated the minute you actually plug into the wall.
We've just had another question coming on the chat from Jaden. Are there any decent heuristics for optimizing on PC, even if there aren't the kind of tools consoles have available? And that's particularly important, I think, for indies without AAA budgets and resources. Yeah, I don't know, like, unless you're building something like what Torbjorn's done, where you optimize. Maybe Laurent, could you maybe speak to the Unity capabilities in this way?
Yeah, of course. There is a lot of things actually we can do, and I think part of the conversation around like making the kind of event happen here in Montreal, or trying to get the conversation going across the game industry, is to also surface the best practices. Like, there's a lot we can do, but we don't really like explain it super well or highlight the best practices so well to game creators so that they actually make things a little bit better. So on PC, you could very much do a little bit of the same mobile tactics you would do on mobile by using the Steam Deck or using Rogue Ally or that kind of like, portable consoles where you can measure more efficiently energy consumption directly at the battery level. Like, just unplug the console and just see, how your actual game perform. So that's one way to try to optimize the software. And there's many ways to do optimization. So some of those are, I would say, graphics related. There is a lot of battery hit that is happening with memory transfer from CPU to GPU. So there is a lot of gains that can be made at the graphics pipeline level by limiting bandwidth that transfers, memory around. And there is a bunch of tools that are available in game engines to try to reduce this. Then there is reduction of the CPU, like actual consumption itself. But in some of the examples that Ben's been showing, it's a lot about like drawing pixels on the GPU side. Then memory transfer is a big one, and then CPU consumption is the last one. Later this year at Unite, we have the Unity convention that's happening November 19, 20 in Barcelona, and we're going to have additional talks around trying to merge some of those best practices in clear way to get developers, so you can start implementing some of those like optimizations in your game. And like you were showing a little bit earlier, when dropping your frame rate because it's useless to run too fast to actually the gameplay experience, you can get similar gains in memory transfers and CPU consumption in the game. It's just that we need to direct you to the best tools to do that in your game. So there is a range of options available. The format at today probably doesn't give you enough time to talk about all those things, but we're trying to make a conscious effort to summarize everything you can do to optimize at those 3 different steps of your game and make that more easily available to everybody.
Yeah, I want to add something. I don't work in Unity, but I use Unity since 2012, so I witnessed the progress of since 3.x until now. And I want to say that Unity is doing a great job by offering the profiling mode. There is a mode profiling, you can activate it, you can see everything happening in your game, from draw calls to rendering, vertices, everything. The communication between the CPU and the GPU, the transfer, the network, and everything. So yeah, Unity profiling is your best tool when it comes to optimization. And to be honest, FPS for me is the last thing I see, because the FPS is one number that represents a lot of things, but maybe it's like it's hot now. Is it the heating system or the global warming? So there's a lot of factors when we talk about the FPS. One of them is the optimization of the object. So you can put a 3 million 3 million polygon object where you don't need it. So LOD system, and there is a lot of optimization. For example, I teach Game Engine 1, and from the first semester when they start learning game engines, there is a chapter in the last in the end of the semester that explains some of those techniques, like the frustum culling, like the rendering techniques, what we can do. So yeah, honestly, in Unity, we have the profiling that explains every single detail. And there's a lot, like the memory conception, what you are rendering now, what the camera is looking at, what objects are inside the rendering process, what objects need to be excluded from the rendering. And also, one thing that I saw you mentioning, which is screen dimming. So that's not 100% reflecting because the graphic card and the computer and everything is happening. Is doing the computation, is only the screen, which is the minor part. So there is more to work on the graphic rendering pipeline, more than just the screen, because the screen, yeah, how much? Few, but the work need to be done on the rendering pipeline itself.
So I was just going to add one other thing too, but before we move on, is sorry, I'm losing my train of thought now. It's quite late here. Optimization in almost all of these examples is happening after the game is launched and after the game is finished, with the exception of the menu design, you know, the 2.5D menu thing, which is kind of like, you know, you bake that into your design process. So a lot of the optimization, I think it benefits the, you know, this challenge of finding energy savings in ways that don't, you know, get cannibalized by, you know, improving the graphics in other ways, to kind of have the optimization be one of the last things that you do in the pipeline, I think. Yeah, there may be other approaches, and we might want to change that heuristic in the future, but I think that's probably a good rule of thumb, is like finish the game first and then, you know, see what you can kind of, you know, figure it out afterwards, yeah, to optimize, especially if it's a big success. So
yeah, there are things that are difficult to optimize after the fact, unfortunately. So yeah, a lot of, like, at least what we can try to do is to educate the community, the game creator community, at least on our end, to get them to adopt some of the best practices early on in their production, because there was a lot of good things they could do that would have like even larger impact. But once the game is cooked, it's a little bit harder to make that happen.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, to be honest. Like, thank you, Ben, for showing us all of those numbers. This is the first time I see something like that. So, to be honest, like, I always see people talking about things like there and here, but now, like, I see a good presentation focusing on games. That's very important. And also, like, for our community, like, we need to see more of those presentation, like, dealing with a very unique thing that we do, which is game programming. Like, yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, been my pleasure. Would you like to see the last kind of bit of the kind of the workshop? I mean, we have like 10 minutes left. What I was going to suggest was, if anyone has a Steam game that you have launched, you know, if you have access to the Steam data, we can use a spreadsheet to give you a good estimate of the sort of impact of downloads that you've had. I don't know if you've got access to that. Let me show you. I'll just show you how it works. So you can kind of use this at any point in the future. So next week we're launching the SGA standard. All of this stuff will go up on the website. But basically what we've produced is a really simple spreadsheet that anyone can use. This is, you know, the tool that, you know, is most accessible. For downloads, there are 3 parts to it. There's the initial install, there's kind of any follow-up updates, and then there's like the device, you know, that's actually running to do the download. You know, this is just for completeness sake. We'll just look at installs. What you do, if you have a Steam game, if you have Steam data, you just log into the Steam partner backend, navigate to the downloads by region section, and you literally just click export. It will give you a CSV of all the number of downloads by region. And yeah, it will like, yeah, just say, okay, this many downloads in the USA or this many in this country, blah, 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 all of that. All you need to do really is copy and paste that into our Steam data input spreadsheet. And then you need to fill out the bit at the top, which has like a basic game setting. So you put in how big the initial game file is. This is the download, how big it is. And then, yeah, you copy and paste, and the spreadsheet will calculate automatically for you what we think is a reasonable, well, it's a kind of worst case scenario. This is like the most emissions that it could possibly be, because it's based on estimates of what kind of energy consumption is involved in serving up data from a server. What we really need is we need Steam to tell us. We need to tell us what is involved with downloading a gigabyte from a Steam server. We just don't know. So we have to use sort of proxies and stuff. So if you go to tinyurl.com/SGA Unity, you can see the spreadsheet, and yeah, we can like plug in the data as we go. I don't know if I'm sharing the right screen anymore now, though. Let me just double check the name. Oh yeah, okay, this one. All right, so I'll just show you the demo version because we're basically out of time. But I've got some example data. This is what the format of the CSV output from Steam looks like. This is from a really small indie game. You just copy the country and the total downloads like so into the Steam download section. So the game, we put the game name in over there, copy and paste it, and I'll just do it, paste the values only. And I'll call this test 1. And I'll run that to the bottom. And then at the top, I'll say test 1 has a install file size of, let's say, 10 gigabytes. So test 1 in the US, 424 downloads. This is the US most recent. So up here, I've selected 2024. That's the most year we have the most recent data from. If different regions had a specific file size on Steam, because sometimes you pack additional language files or other things in there, you could put it in as an override, but otherwise it just uses the default. There's a network component. So this is the back-end infrastructure between the Steam server and the player. And then there's the data center itself. And both of those get automatically calculated and give you an emissions total for that region, as well as a kind of energy consumption total. So 400 downloads of 10 gigabytes, we think, again, this is like a worst case scenario, could be as much as 1,000 kilowatt hours. That does seem like a lot, but that's kind of the global data center average. Maybe it's a little bit out of date, which is be about half a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, it just kind of adds it all up, and yeah. So again, to your point of we need these tools specific to the games industry. This is our very first iteration of it. It will get better, and yeah, feel free to have a go at it at your leisure. And yeah, maybe we'll wrap it up there.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.